Okay, well, I think we should get going. We're at the top of the hour. My name is Megan Dotson, and I'm the program manager for the National American Indian and Alaska Native MHTTC. And as you can see, we're going to have this wonderful webinar today on Two-Eyed Seeing, the synergism between Native wisdom traditions and Western science, featuring Mike Bricker. So we're pleased to have him. We are part of the MHTTC network. As you'll see on this map here, we have some regional centers, an MHTTC network coordinating office, and we are located right here in Iowa City, Iowa. So this webinar today is the project that's supported by SAMHSA. However, the content is developed by the presenter, and the opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect the views or policies of SAMHSA, HHS, or the American Indian and Alaska Native MHTTC. Following today's event, you will receive an email, which will include links to the presentation, recordings and slides, information about how to request and receive CEUs, and a link to our evaluation survey we call GIPRA. So please take a moment to complete that evaluation. It's very important to us. We would like to take a moment here to acknowledge the land. So although we have gathered virtually today, we want to take the time to acknowledge the land and pay respect to the Indigenous nations whose homelands were forcibly taken and inhabited. So if you mind, please taking a moment to read this land acknowledgement, which was created by 3 members of our team, Ella and Keely Driscoll and Sean Bear. And this will also be available in your handouts if you'd like to read again about this. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike and have him start sharing his screen, and we'll get started with today's presentation. Thank you, Mike.
Okay, thank you very much, Megan, for the introduction. I have trouble thinking and talking at the same time, so I'm trying to get my screen share up here. I want to thank you for this opportunity. I'm not going to launch into my resume and stuff. That's one of the things that really kind of bugs me is when presenters get up there and have to read through their whole resume and their CV and all of that stuff. The best things to know about me, I guess, are that I'm a professional clinician. I'm a professional trainer. I'm a person in long-term recovery, if that's important to anybody but me. But since about 1984, I've been particularly interested in co-occurring disorders, which I prefer to talk about as dual recovery. And for the last 20 years or so, I've been privileged to do some work in Indian country and to learn from the people there. So I want to thank you for this opportunity to share some thoughts, and please know that I'm in this learning with you. I am not the content expert here. I couldn't presume to talk about Native wisdom traditions, but I do think it's important enough that we have that dual awareness, being able to see with 2 eyes, which has been called etwapunk. And if there are any Mi'kmaq who are watching, please forgive me for butchering your mother tongue. But this is me. I'm a NADAC approved education provider. I do a lot of training. I have a lot of information that's available for folks if you're interested. But particularly, I want to call your attention to our elders who are going to be presenting remotely. I have some recordings from 2 of the elders, Albert and Medina Marshall, who were really kind of the prime movers of the whole Ethnwalkmuk movement. And also a delightful young woman named Rebecca Thomas, who has some very powerful thoughts to offer on this whole thing. this really is about the confluence of Native and Western worldviews. So let me talk just a little bit about my streams. First of all, I want to honor the peoples, the Umpqua, the Silets, and the Puyallup, and other nations who have lived from time before memory in East Central Oregon, where I'm speaking from. It's important to say that I have no Native blood that I know of, but I've been privileged to work with Native tribes in Alaska and the Upper Midwest and the Navajo Nation for quite a while. So it's been an honor for me to be part of this exploration and learning from my uncles and grandfathers about the richness of Native wisdom traditions that have been shared with me, and to find some ways to blend them with Western research-based treatment that I think really can benefit both. But you got to know that I'm a white guy. Okay, that's how I was raised. So this is always from the perspective of a white male from European heritage. And a lot of this you'll find was really originally designed to help folks like me work more effectively with folks like you. So some of these things were really intended more for a non-Native audience, or at least people having that awareness. So I want to thank you for the gift of your time, and kind of move on. This is one of my favorite quotes from a woman named Anais Nin. We don't see things as they are. We see things as we are. So this idea of two-eyed seeing, in English, the word perspective literally comes from the Latin word for to see. Spectare is the Latin word for the root for to be able to see. And per is also implies in Latin seeing through something, seeing through the most immediate impression to what's beyond. And so in our context, a perspective is a way of seeing the world. It's influenced by our beliefs and our experiences, and it's the way that we see something. If you happen to believe that toys corrupt children's minds, then from your perspective, a toy shop is an evil place. So even with both of your eyes pointing forward, they each look at the world from two slightly different vantage points. And it follows that each eye receives a slightly different picture of the three-dimensional scene around us. And these differences are proportional to the relative distances of objects from you. And I'm hoping that you can see in the camera. I'm going to invite you to try a little experiment. I'm going to step a little bit back from the camera. If you would, hold one finger up kind of 6 inches or so from your nose, and hold the other one out at about arm's length. And just look alternately, close one eye and the other. And you'll notice that each eye has a slightly different perspective. So looking at this, what is it that you see? Now what do you see? This is kind of an ambiguous figure. And so we see what we expect to see. When presented with a picture of the Energizer Bunny, most people will look at this and say, oh, that's a rabbit who's looking off to the right. And other people will say, oh, this is obviously a duck that's looking off to the left. So we see what we're programmed to see. And we're not always conscious of how that programming affects the way that we see the world. We all think that there's such a thing as objective reality. Well, sometimes not. Sometimes the context really shapes the impression that we get out of what we think is quote unquote the real deal. This is just an optical illusion. Obviously the bar it's all one color, except when it's put into a different context, and all of a sudden it appears to be different. So differing worldviews have different realities. every reality, every perception of reality has an element of validity to it. They do not discredit or displace each other. And that, I think, is really the key element of two-eyed seeing, is that native wisdom traditions do not co-opt, overrun, overpower Western science, which is a lot more charitable than the way that Western science has treated native wisdom traditions, with a lot of discounting and just a lot of colonialism, unconscious colonialism, sometimes very deliberate colonial disrespect of native wisdom traditions. Natasha, I'm going to ask you to launch this poll. I just wanted to get have an opportunity for you to kind of look at, in your own mind, where do you find yourself on this balance? So if you'd be kind enough to take the poll. And as we're doing this, it's important to recognize that this is just a wonderful opportunity that the MHTTC has given us to share resources with each other. So if you as participants have any Western or cultural resources that you would like to share, please feel free to type them into the chat. And then, or if you have any questions, and then at the end, if we have time, we can have a little bit of discussion, or if we don't have time, Natasha will graciously print out the chat, and I'll answer questions, and we'll share resources with each other. Let's see. So clearly people have some familiarity just looking at the preliminary results. Clearly people have some appreciation of the value that Western kind of manualized evidence-based practices can bring. And while we're doing these polls, and Natasha, you can just keep rolling them whenever you think folks are ready. Let me respectfully give you my rant about evidence-based practices. Western research-based practices are extremely valuable. They're very, very helpful. But it's important to have an awareness that these studies, by and large, are normed on people we don't serve. Okay, if you're doing a replication of a study involving a manualized evidence-based practice, nobody wants a flaming borderline in your control group. People with co-occurring disorders are frequently screened out of study cohorts. People who have histories of trauma routinely might not find their way in. So it's important to just have that awareness that as useful as they can be, we have to be mindful that their usefulness is limited, and just following the manual is, in my opinion, not very effective. Okay, so there we have. So there's definitely an awareness of the value, and then okay, and moving down. Oh, I see. Scrolling down. Okay. That's not surprising. Okay, good. Okay. So Natasha, if you want to back that out. Okay, so moving on. We do have some time restraints that we need to be conscious of. Two-eyed seeing is this guiding principle that's brought into the integrative science by Mi'kmaq elder named Albert Marshall about 16 years ago. This is not new news. This has been developing in Native country for quite a while. And etuaptmunk is the Mi'kmaq word for this two-eyed seeing. It refers to learning with one eye the strengths of indigenous wisdom, and with the other eye the richness that Western research and science can bring to it, in such a way that they actually enhance each other. Each one makes the other not better or worse, but more effective, which is probably the best yardstick for measuring this kind of stuff. This is Albert Marshall, and let me give you this.
Actually, Mike, you're sharing your presentation view with us.
Albert Marshall is among the most respected wisdom keepers of the Mi'kmaq people, whose territory of Mi'kma'ki includes all of Atlantic Canada, plus parts of both Quebec and Maine. He's much in demand as a speaker and a teacher, an authority on matters as diverse as traditional healing and teaching, the Mi'kmaq language, indigenous ways of understanding science, and the environment. But he's particularly celebrated for his concept of two-eyed seeing, using the insights of Western science in combination with the traditional wisdom of his culture and language to obtain a depth of understanding that neither could achieve alone.
I call her my master because she was raised by Grand Chief Gables. Boy, and I never used it, but I was somewhat short because of the residential school. You know what I mean? There was a gap there where all this time I should have been learning from my father and from my uncles.
And you're at the residential school instead.
You know what I mean?
I do.
So, but I was blessed to meet a woman like Medina.
You're bringing us right to the point of two-eyed seeing, right?
You see, two-eyed seeing, in my understanding, is very much inherent in the Aboriginal ways of thinking. And I don't want to get the impression that I'm going to take a credit of developing the two-eyed seeing. The only credit that I can take is, we had to coin it. Coin it from looking at everything from another perspective. That's two-eyed seeing. So two-eyed seeing then was initially was targeting our youth to look at everything from another perspective. We have to coexist with these people that are here. But you have every legal prerogative for you to determine what best you want from that culture. Because you already know you have the best of what you have from your culture that has been passed on from your ancestors. And you have this legal prerogative. Put those two concepts together so that it'll better prepare you to meet whatever challenges may be. So two-eyed seeing is not meant to look at everything as to how can you question the integrity of an action or the integrity of a word. But I, as an individual, with my curiosity working overdrive, I have this inherent responsibility to look at this concept or these actions and try to transform it by fine-tuning it to be that much more reflective for me, for myself, so I could be much more effective as I employ these two perspectives or multiple perspectives, so that my efforts will be much more beneficial for the common good. This concept or this ideology or philosophy is not necessarily redundant, but it needs reinforcement. And that reinforcement will be continuously, because you're on this journey of co-learning, learning from, not just from another humanity, another human beings, but constantly learning of these changes that are constantly occurring around you. So it's a constant flux. Isn't this what evolution is? You know what I mean?
Okay, and I realized I was sharing a different screen. I apologize for the technical difficulties, but you can see what a tremendously powerful concept this is, coming from right from the elder himself. Okay, let's. This is just a one way of looking at the two-eyed seeing, looking at how it works into the world of research. Next slide. Looking at some of the differences between Indigenous and Western worldviews. And remember that this is designed to be a both and, not distinguishing in the sense of one is better than the other. Okay, so some of the distinctions, and this is not new news to anybody, but I think sometimes it's useful to see these things all kind of in one place. Some of the differences are that, natives tend to be a spiritually oriented culture. Beliefs and ceremonies and tradition, and particularly lived experience, is critically important. Scientific Western science tends to be skeptical by definition. They're always looking to disprove rather than to embrace, which leads to the idea that there's really only one truth, which is based on science or the Western type laws that we've all agreed on. Whereas in many wisdom traditions, Indigenous traditions, there can be a lot of different truths that depend on individual beliefs and experiences. Native culture in general tends to operate on relatedness, that recognizing that all things are interconnected, mitakuyoyasi, the whole idea of all my relations. Traditions, kinship, all of these things reinforce that kind of connectedness. And my identity comes from my standing in family and tribe and community, as opposed to Western culture tends to be a culture of individuality. And it's always about us and them. It's always about that division. One of the biggest things that's coming to the forefront now with climate change is recognition that that the land is sacred, that the land is here for all of us. It's for all living creatures. It's not just for mankind. And Western science says that, well, the land and its resources are here for development and ownership and extraction for the benefit of humans, particularly certain humans. One of the key differences is the concept of time. In many Indigenous traditions, time is nonlinear. It's cyclical in nature. There are cycles of nature, there are cycles of traditions and ceremonial cycles that are really key. And time actually happens in events, as opposed to Western ways of looking at things where time is linear and unidirectional, and it's measured and it's chopped up, and the future is more important than the past, and events happen in time rather than time happening in events. the sense of security and sense of self is in indigenous cultures tends to be measured by the quality of relationships, and particularly our relationships, our spiritual connections with the Great Spirit, whatever that is for you, and particularly all of my relations, all of the world around me. And in Western culture, it tends to be comfortable and secure as measured by achieving my goals. How much, I am my bank account. Indigenous cultures around the globe tend to recognize that humans are not the end all and be all of creation. They are simply a part of the whole, as opposed to Western science or Western culture says that we're the most important thing in the world. And we take the injunction in the Bible too literally, to inherit the earth and subdue it. Not a very native way of looking at things. The whole idea of the potlatch, amassing wealth or possessions, is important for the benefit of the community, not for the benefit of us as an individual person. And our status in many indigenous cultures, status is measured by how much you give away, as opposed to in Western culture, it's how much you keep. Some looking at differences in communication. There are some different ways that things like symbolism and volume, the volume of speech, the rhythm of speech, the style of communication overall, the tone of communication, and without, as you look at these two pyramids, it's not difficult to guess which is which. But when you look at differences that are this deeply rooted and unconscious or pre-conscious, is it any wonder that there's a lot of misunderstanding between the two cultures? The Western worldview tends to look at a hierarchical universe. There's, at the top, there's God and science. There's angels or scientists. And then there's us and them and everybody else. And everything is subjugated below that. Where, as opposed to many indigenous wisdom traditions, honor a more cyclical or a concentric idea of the universe. I'm going to play another video. This one is just a tiny bit longer, and I'm hoping that the technology works a little bit better, because what this woman has to say was tremendously moving for me, and I hope that it will be helpful for you as well.
Gwe, Ninda Louisi, Rebecca. Hi, my name is Rebecca. Shall we? The language you speak fundamentally shapes your worldview and everything that goes along with it. And this concept is specifically amplified when it comes to Indigenous languages. Indigenous language weaves its way through every aspect of who we are as people, from how we interact with the physical world, how we build our communities, and how we carry our culture forward. And with that comes a unique perspective. And it's that perspective that I'm going to try to create for you, so that when I introduce the concept of eduuptamonk, of two-eyed seeing, you'll understand why it's so important. So to begin, a study published in Psychological Sciences called Two Languages, Two Minds broke down grammatical tools that situate actions in time. They showed photographs to English and German speakers and asked them to describe what was going on in them. So for example, they showed a woman walking in a parking lot. English speakers said, "This is a woman walking." Whereas German speakers said, "This is a woman walking to her car." They showed another photograph, a man riding his bicycle. Once again, English speakers honed in on the action and said, "This is a man riding his bicycle," whereas German speakers needed to add a destination to complete their context, even though that destination wasn't featured in the photograph. This is a man riding his bicycle to the library or to the supermarket. And what's interesting is that English marks events as ongoing. We're very action-oriented in our language. So if I'm writing a poem when my spouse calls and he asks me what I'm doing, I'll say, "I'm writing." regardless of the fact that I had stopped to answer the phone. German simply doesn't have this feature. And so it's interesting to see the two worldviews these languages carry, even though they have a common root. So what happens when you have a group of people with a language that has no common root, but must operate within a completely foreign framework? Specifically, how do Indigenous people find success in a colonized world? Now, the saying, things get lost in translation, rings truer than you might imagine when it comes to Indigenous languages. This is Mi'kmaq territory, and many of you might have heard the word Jalasi to mean welcome. That's what it's used for, but the literal translation of the concept equates to, I'll do my best. That's a much more nuanced and meaningful interaction. In this moment, a person-to-person contract is being agreed upon. Think about that. In this moment, I will try for you. So language isn't just something we use to get our points across. As I said, it's woven into who we are as people and our notions of a broader identity. So Robert Thomas, no relation, wrote about that broader identity, and he called it peoplehood when referring to Indigenous peoples. Now, the term peoplehood is a little bit odd, so I'm going to break it down for you. Peoplehood differs from identity in that it not only encompasses the individual identity, but how that person ties it to a larger collection of peoples and how that in turn connects them to other people within that collective. So for example, I don't speak Mi'kmaq and I grew up off reserve, but I still identify as a Mi'kmaq person. I'm still within the concept of a Mi'kmaq peoplehood, and that in turn connects me to somebody who grew up on reserve and who speaks the language. And it's getting a bit complex, so please bear with me. Peoplehood is made up of four things: territory, sacred history, ceremonial cycle, and language. Each thread informs the other. You can't address a single aspect of it without looking at the whole. Think of a spider web. If you clip a single thread that anchors it, the whole thing starts to collapse. So the Mi'kmaq language, for example, with its unique characteristics, gives meaning to a sacred history which dictates the use of the land, which is crucial to the appropriate execution of a ceremonial cycle, which in turn is performed in many of the languages that those ceremonies encompass. So firstly, that is a direct quote from my MA, so I'm going to take this moment and feel vindicated in my decision to pursue another arts degree. And secondly, Indigenous peoples are complicated and complex. Imagine centuries ago when we were writing the treaties and the language we were communicating in encompassed how we would use the land, how would we carry our culture forward, how would we develop relationships with the settlers and colonizers. Now, how much of that was lost in translation when they were recorded in English and French? So I digress, but remember those four strands: language, ceremonial cycle, territory, and sacred history. The best part about peoplehood is that it is tremendously flexible. We can swap out and alter some of those strands without compromising our status as Indigenous people. So once again, I'm going to use my lived experience as an example. You already know I don't speak Mi'kmaq, and that's because through residential school, my primary language thread has been replaced with English and French. So if I go to a ceremony that's conducted entirely in the Mi'kmaq language, the significance of that ceremony might not fully resonate with me because I won't understand the full scope of what's being said, but that does not diminish who I am as a Mi'kmaq person. Furthermore, there are many Mi'kmaq people who are practicing Catholics. So even though they smudge and they dance and they drum and they sweat, they also go to church and pray in the Mi'kmaq language, and that does not take away from them. They have woven another set of ceremonies into their ceremonial thread. Because being an Indigenous person is a lived experience. There's no spectrum whereby somebody is more or less Native than somebody else. Any arguments over authenticity are us internalizing a history of colonialism that has created rubrics and tools to measure our ethnicity. And blood quantum has nothing to do with it. The fact that my mother is non-Native does not take away from the fact that I am a Mi'kmaq person. So with that said, I'm going to check in with you guys. Language shapes your worldview. and is one of 4 aspects that create an Indigenous peoplehood, an Indigenous understanding of knowing of how the world works. So when you look at the picture that I'm trying to paint for you, you're going to understand what you're looking at. So here's the picture. Indigenous peoples are the fastest growing demographic in Canada. Our median age is 28 years old compared to that of 43 to the non-native world. And what that means is you're going to see more of us in your classrooms, in your workspaces, and in your public spaces. The world is going to have to learn to interact with us in ways that are more meaningful and significant than what they have done in the past. I don't need to elaborate for you all to know we don't have the best history. So what? That's the question I always get asked. How does this apply to the real world? I work in student services, in education. I act as a go-between for the Native and non-Native world. I advocate for students who have a hard time speaking up about themselves. I coach faculty on how to have appropriate cultural supports. And yet, in spite of what I try to do, sometimes the effects an Indigenous student feels are too great and they leave to go home. And it's not that they're not smart. It's not that they aren't capable of doing the work. It's just that this world doesn't get them. Our protocols, our concepts of time, our ethics, etc., are just different. And it doesn't mean we can't communicate with your world. We've been doing it for the better part of 5 centuries. It's that we ask that you now try to communicate with our world. And it is at this moment that I introduced the concept of eduoctum, two-eyed seeing. It was introduced by Elder Albert Marshall. Two-eyed seeing takes the strengths of both a colonized world and both an Indigenous world and asks that the user see through both lenses simultaneously to find success. It is the Mi'kmaq understanding of the gift of multiple perspectives, to see multiple contexts simultaneously. For example, you see Nova Scotia, Nouvelle-Écosse, Canada. We see Mi'kmaq, traditional territory, Turtle Island. It's not either or, it's both at the same time. Two-eyed seeing was originally introduced to build greater capacity for STEM programming for Indigenous students in post-secondary institutions, and is now being adopted nationally by organizations and institutions who are interested in transcultural collaboration. Two-eyed seeing implies responsibilities for reciprocity, mutual accountability, and co-learning. It's what we tried to build our treaties on. We want you to know about us and we want success in this world, but we are no longer willing to give up our world to do it. And you might be asking yourself, why would I go through so much trouble to indigenize the institution for such a small number of students? And the answer, my friends, is beautiful. It has been shown, it has been proven that when institutions implement Indigenous pedagogy and learning styles, students across the board benefit, Native and non-Native. Because we recognize the multiple contexts and paradigms that learners learn through, our ways of teaching have traditionally been more universal and more inclusive. So, with all of my academic speak and concept introduction, I bring it back to the elders who always tend to say it best. With regards to education and relationship building, according to Albert Marshall, the foundational basis of any relationship is an exchange of stories. So as a storyteller and as a poet, I will leave you all with what I do best. A poem entitled Eduoctum. I lost my talk, said Rita Jo. For me, I was never given the option to know, to feel the flow of the words as they rolled off my tongue, giving me the lyrics of how our world was sung. My perspective was spun using the threads of both your world and theirs, left to cobble together a spirit from rags and tears, painfully aware that I was different. Through hard work and determination, I found my Indigenous articulation. A compilation of 2 ways makes up the sum of me. You have two eyes, yet you only have one view. Your way is best, you would argue. Centuries of being in position to subdue those who would aspire. They say the sun never set on the British Empire. And because we recognize the hubris that defines your story, we have both a sunrise and a sunset in our territory. With my heart and eyes, I have a completely different view. The consequence of my skin comes in an entirely different hue. Don't you see? Although you represent us, we think very differently than you because we see the world not through one set of eyes, but through two. Thousands of years long, we were independent, proud, and strong. We belong to this earth. The way power belongs to money and privilege to birth, we put our communities first. But then came the fleets, filled with those you would ironically define today as come from away to invade every inch of our world, to break our spirits and pull the threads that would unfurl us, to catch the way you speak. But this is not a poem for the retelling of a one-sided history. Each of our worlds has their strengths. Yours is in power. It gets to eat its cake and define race. It has the ability to unapologetically take up space if societal progress is linear. This society is top tier, terra nullius, as though we were never here. It must be nice to be so confident. This society is ubiquitous, built on reified rubrics of tradition and rhetoric. Your notions of diversity are ad hoc in nature, an afterthought feature to an immovable structure. But this is not a conviction nor an acquittal. Just the voice coming from an eye trained to be critical. And if you push the two sides of our Venn diagram together, you'll get our circle. We were never meant to be static like the rivers around us. We shift and change and remain dynamic. We bring something to the table that is able to change your worldview and show you what we are capable of, that a lot can come from a holistic concept of the earth. You are not a flag, nor we a curse or a problem in need of a solution. And we've got to rid ourselves of the spiritual dissolution, the dilution of our treaties written to share this land. And I ask that you understand that we are the experts on what we need. Don't feed us your good intentions. Carefully laid apologies will not get you an historical exemption. We plan our actions for the next 7 generations, and we invite you to do the same. Open your other set of eyes, take a pause, and start breathing. Welcome to the world of two-eyed seeing. Thank you. Walalia.
Wow. I'm going to move. I'm going to move through some of these slides. A lot of these are fairly self-explanatory. I have nothing to say that is more important than what she had to say. And I think that's really important to realize that. She talks about the Mi'kmaq culture and the 7 sacred teachings of love, honesty, humility, and all of those things. This is nothing new. But traditional Western knowledge is predominantly shaped by these conventional scientific approaches that try to dice and slice the world, and to come up with explanations that are made up of an aggregate of little parts, as opposed to looking at the whole view, back to Etmaktuak and looking at things with both eyes. She talked about the Venn diagram. I'm not going to try and go through this, but when we look at Western science is designed by splitters. Okay. We're always in science, we're always looking for what makes this not that. We're always looking for the distinctions. We're always looking for the separations, thinking that that's going to bring a richness of perspective. On the other hand, other indigenous ways of looking at the world are made up of lumpers. We're always looking for the common thread that makes this useful for us in this moment, in this situation, which brings us to the common ground that's identified here. And all of this is in the handout slides that you'll see. So this is where Etmatkuak comes into play. When we look at looking at where did you go? Looking for native wisdom traditions and Western scientific research and two-eyed seeing brings the richness of all of these into a perspective that's more useful. Just for a moment, think about a visit to a Western style doctor's office or a clinic. What's the very first thing that happens? The first thing that happens is somebody hands you a clipboard that is supposed to help you tell them who you are. And so you get your name, your address, your telephone number, your insurance card, and all of that stuff, all of that paperwork about insurance. And then somebody that you've never met comes in and puts a bunch of stuff on your arms and takes your blood pressure and your temperature and your vital signs and sticks something in your ear and then walks out. And you sit. And then a doctor comes in and spends about 12 minutes, orders a bunch of tests, hands you a prescription. This is healthcare. Other wisdom traditions, I think, do it better. When we look at family, the extended family, the tribe, and the cultural context as being one of the primary vehicles of health and healing, that information, communication that's respectful of both scientific realities and also the cultural context in which those realities exist. That relationship is the primary context for any kind of healing. That we have to create a safe space where the context of cultural respect and non-colonial worldviews are primary. And treatment which embraces both of those things, both the Western and the traditional modalities for healing. If you step back far enough, symbols from one culture can readily fit into another context. The American Society of Addiction Medicine, you know, the 6 dimensions of ASAM, when you look at it, can be interpreted in terms of some concepts of the medicine wheel. One of the things that was a real challenge, I was privileged for a number of years, about 12 years, to work on the Southwest Delta in Alaska, working for the Phillips Acknowledgement Treatment Center in Bethel. And one of the really big challenges was, you know, how do you document a sweat lodge in such a way that insurance will pay for it? And there was a lot of work that was done, not just by me, to look at some of these let me get my pointer here. Yeah, that's what I want. These traditional activities and looking at the types of Western style interventions that approximate them. Looking at this again is from Phillips Acknowledgement. Acknowledgement is the Yupik word for a new beginning. Looking at how both solid Western-based research and mental health for addiction treatment and solid mental health treatment for PTSD and you know, intergenerational trauma, but how those things are held together by the rungs of culture and ceremony and wisdom and elders being an integral part on a daily basis of the treatment, you know, of the treatment milieu, and songs and crafts being honored for the richness that they bring. Here's another example of two-eyed seeing approach to delivering seeking safety. Looking at Lisa Nayavet's Seeking Safety, which is a manualized best practice, but looking at it in the context of Native ways of knowing. Lisa Nayavet was actually a part of this study. She's actually one of the, where is it? She's one of the authors. And what that does is it looks at the concepts of two-eyed seeing and seeking safety and looks at it in terms of the medicine wheel. And what are the unique learnings that go with each of these parts of the ceremonial and cycle of nature? And this was done by a gentleman named Rod Vickers. And this is not new. This has been around for a while. Probably one of the best examples that folks are really familiar with is Wellbriety, the Red Road to Sobriety, the Native American stuff from Don Coyhe's and White Bison. who take the 12 steps and filter the 12 steps of Alcoholics and Narcotics Anonymous through the lens of native wisdom and the concept of connection being central to everything. And this is nothing new. I mean, you know, addiction is a disease of isolation. And so reconnection is so terribly important. He takes the 12 steps and places them around the medicine wheel. I know that you all know this. This is a very good book, by the way. If any of you don't come from a native culture, this is a very good book on understanding native culture for people who are non-natives working in it. But one of the things that he does, that Don Coyhes does, he just did a tremendous keynote at the NADAC conference last week or 2 weeks ago. But looking at the ongoing impact of this colonial subjugation and the forced removals, the intergenerational trauma, and the unconscious racism that goes along with this, and the terrible, terrible effect that it's had on indigenous cultures, and not just in America, by the way. So what his whole idea of the healing forest, that, you know, an individual tree healing on its own is not going to be successful. We have to have a healthy ground. We have to have a healthy earth in which to root our recovery.
Hey,
And-
Mike, I just wanted to tell you, this is Megan. Since we had a few of the tech issues, I'd like you to keep going if you don't mind.
Oh, sure.
And those who can stay are more than welcome. And those who have to leave, don't forget you'll be getting the recordings and all of this. So please continue.
And hopefully a well-edited recording. And there really isn't all that much more. I mean, I'm going to go through a few more resources at the end. But again, all of this material is available in the slides. So some kinds of indigenous knowledge, however, simply fall outside the way that Western folks understand things. Western knowledge tends to be very text-oriented, it's reductionistic, it's hierarchical, it depends on categorization, putting things into categories. Indigenous science doesn't look for that. It looks for a particular orientation that is defined by the context in which it's happening. This can be a real tremendous boon to Western science and to the way that we do mental health and substance abuse treatment. Hypotheses that incorporate these traditional knowledge-based information can lead the way towards unique insights. These partnerships are developing worldwide with indigenous wisdom holders and Western scientists working together. I'm humbly privileged to have had a small part in some of this learning, but it's problematic because so many things have been dismissed by so many for so long. And one of the dangers, and I try to be very careful about this in my own work, is not co-opting these things. In other words, the whole idea of kind of stealing the culture. For instance, I'm not native, but I'm wearing an eagle fan. The eagle fan was a gift to me by a Hatachli that I worked with on the Navajo Nation. It's not just that I want to kind of look Indian when I'm doing this. We as a European culture have been so dismissive of native ways of looking at things that we really, really need to back up and take a better look, because our way is ruining the planet. This is a little bit out of context, but for years, Native people have developed ways to manage the land, to manage the resources, to manage the fish and the ocean and the land, prescribed burning and recognizing that fire is not a bad thing when it's part of the natural cycle of things. And this comes from my part of the world, the Umpqua Nation, working with tribal forestry and working together. So this is not just about mental health treatment. This Etwalktumuk originally came out of the ecological sciences, fish management, and management of resources, and things like that. And we're kind of late to the party in terms of our behavioral health stuff. So it's important to know that there is no single Indigenous or Western way of knowing. It's easy to fall into that trap of trying to kind of homogenize and blend everything together. And when we do that, we lose the richness. We lose the richness that each thing brings. With that said, there seem to be a lot of common threads, and Rebecca Thomas actually spoke to a number of them, that around the world seem to be more characteristic of Indigenous cultures, emphasizing an approach to knowledge that is metaphysical and holistic and rich with oral symbolism and relational and intergenerational. These kinds of things are not easily understood by folks who grew up in Western culture. Rebecca talked about this, the very last sentence of this. An important question in Indigenous knowledge is, how am I fulfilling my role in this relationship, in this moment in time? Western knowledge tends to be broken into disciplines. I'm not going to belabor this, but Western ways of thinking, there are research paradigms that are more compatible with Indigenous ways of thinking, but we have to be careful to take into account that we are not the owners of this. As a matter of fact, ownership is kind of a foreign concept in many Native traditions. There are some risks as we move down this path together. Some of the risks of trying to integrate these knowledges. One of them is weakening Indigenous traditions by kind of generalizing or taking them out of context. There's a famous book, I forget the author, but it's because more than beads and feathers. There's much more to Native worldviews than that. Denying certain crucial cultural differences in order to find commonality. In this interaction, nobody has to give up anything. And another way is kind of amoebifying or absorbing Indigenous knowledge in such a way that it becomes invisible. It simply becomes homogenized into the general way of looking at things. One way of looking at this that's really kind of valuable is what's called a Moebius strip. We'll get to that in a second. But this is Albert Marshall's way of looking at integrative science, of bringing our sciences together, plural. That Moebius strip, what it is, it's a strip of paper that's been twisted on itself to 90 degrees. And what that means is that you have two sides, but only one surface. And so when you look at it that way, we can take Western science and technology and evidence-based practices and the wisdom of people who have been here since time before memory, helping us to build a healing forest, building these wisdom traditions into everything that we do as Western folks. I use this stuff in my treatment that I do with white folks here in Oregon. It's tremendously effective. But this is where the Etwalktumuk comes in. So respectfully, 12 steps of culturally humble treatment with apologies to Bill and Dr. Bob. We admitted that we were powerless over history and that attempts to change it are going to make everybody's lives unmanageable. We came to believe that a power greater than ourselves, the spirit of the people and the strengths of the community, could restore themselves to sanity. We made a decision to turn our will and our need to help over to the spiritual wisdom of the people as we learn to understand it. We made a fearless and searching inventory of our stereotypes and assumptions and prejudices, and then admitted to God, to ourselves, and to our colleagues the exact nature of our unconscious races. Excuse me. We're entirely ready to allow the spiritual strength and cultural wisdom of the community to guide us in removing these wrong-headed ideas. We humbly asked for guidance from those we came to help. That's hard. That's hard for people to do. But we humbly asked for guidance from the people that we came to help and allowed our experience of them to resolve our own shortcomings. And we made a list of all the people and institutions that we may have offended and became willing to make amends to them all, even when it offends our sense of superiority. We made direct amends to these wherever possible and resolved not to repeat them. We continued to monitor our growth as a human on a daily basis. And when there was something that we needed to learn, we promptly embraced it. We sought through prayer, meditation, and ceremony to improve our conscious contact with the Creator through the people around us, seeking only for knowledge of His will for the people and the strength to be part of that process, not the prime mover of it. And having had a spiritual awakening as a result of this work, we strive to be part of the message of hope to all who are suffering and to walk the sevenfold path of healing in all our affairs. And again, that was written to help non-Native folks be more comfortable working in Native country. This is well, we have some time. Towards the end, I'm gonna cruise through a bunch of other resources, but I think that this is worth.
That's how it started. The communities, the elders were concerned that there were not any students from their communities going into the sciences.
True I see really is, it's and has to be your guiding principles as to how one should live while you are here on this earth.
Two-eyed seeing, as brought to us by Elder Albert Marshall, Mi'kmaq Elder Deskasoni, is recognizing that there are different ways of looking at the world. And maybe two of those ways are the Western scientific way and the Indigenous peoples or the Aboriginal peoples way. And that two-eyed seeing refers to finding the strengths in both of those, the Western and the Indigenous, and mindfully bringing those strengths together, drawing upon the deep understandings that they represent, the strengths of each, and bringing them together to work together to go forward on this planet together.
I feel that what we learned as First Nations people in your own identity, Mi'kmaq, is valuable. I also believe that the concepts being brought on by Europeans is also valuable in today's world. And you try to bring those two together and look at it through two-eyed seeing that both are very valuable and both can be achieved.
Our airs are poisoned, our rivers are poisoned, our forests are pretty much gone, and the animals are extinct even as we speak. With this two-eye seeing, we very quickly realize and see that science is not going to save the environment or the natural world, but rather a change of attitude, change of mindsets.
I see the strengths of Western science as being the ability to look at the physical world, see the patterns within it, and take those patterns apart and find the mechanisms or try to search for the mechanisms that bring those patterns into existence. And then on the basis of that reconstructed understanding, try to improve upon our material existence often for humans in this world. I see the strengths of the indigenous peoples, on the other hand, of also seeing the patterns in the world, but rather than taking them apart to reconstruct them, it's more of a working of patterns within patterns. In other words, a weaving of yourself and your understandings into the world in which you live. I think one of the most exciting and useful ways to teach science would be to use one of the methods from science itself, which is the compare and contrast. Why can't we educate our science students as to what the mainstream way of doing science is, and compare it and contrast with another way of doing science from an indigenous perspective? Why can't we put them side by side and use them to help a student develop a better understanding of what mainstream science is and what other perspectives on science are? That's a scientific method, compare and contrast.
Basically, the education system has taught us to absorb every knowledge we get without actually questioning it or looking at it from another perspective.
Why do we think that we can teach by focus on the one thing when the whole of human consciousness is not a focus on one thing? It's always a back and forth, a scanning of the environment, a compare and contrast, and a past and a future within the present.
With Mi'kmaq identity, as I was growing up, I didn't know any other identity because I was being trained in Mi'kmaq. I was trained in the language, and in the language are embedded all of your oral traditions, all your moral, and all your everyday life. Your history is involved in it, because when you went to bed at night without the competition of television, Atari, and everything else, you had stories. You had stories about your own history. You had stories about everything that it was required to make you into a better human being.
Part of the struggle of anybody, I don't think it matters who you are, is to ask yourself and to learn, who am I? So if an educational system ignores part of who you think you are, simply because it doesn't include your people's understandings, as for example, if the science curricula does not include any of the understandings that Canada's Aboriginal peoples have with respect to the land that they've occupied for thousands of years, then that ability to develop a well-balanced and deep understanding of who you are as a young Aboriginal in Canada today is going to be denied.
Our journey here is not meant for one perspective or one consciousness to get us through. We all need each other. So the lessons that we are trying to put forth now is to our young people. It's going to be much more expedient if we can take the best for whatever tools the white man has brought forth and the tools what our forefathers had left us with.
This tool I've seen is valuable when you pick from two worlds and try to co-join those two. I find it very difficult, but I know it has to be done. I know I can't crawl into my culture and say, oh, that's all I need to survive in this world. I also know that you need the white man's education to survive in this world and be happy. And I think the white man also needs me for what I have to offer.
We have a challenge ahead of us to bring to the attention of that educational system that the Western way of looking at things is but one way.
Paraphrasing Chief Dan George saying, we shall take the instruments of the white man, his tools and his education, and we'll incorporate them with ours so we can create a better world for everyone.
I apologize for cutting off for cutting off the song, but just in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of these. This is kind of a one-page summary of the slides that come after this. There are individual, these are individual examples of how two-eyed seeing or Atuaptmuk can be used in the work that we do. The references are all there. You can click on the hot links. There's more information here than you could possibly use. I think that it's a useful way to look at this as all of these individual threads, the community resources and family and consumer strengths and cultural assets and elder wisdoms and ceremonies kind of focused through the lens of
I'll get it right back. I'll get it right back. I said no. I know.
what an exuberant sound. Anyway, it's probably a suitable end to today's entertainment, but using the behavioral health team and hopefully a behavioral health team that includes elders, that includes people who are recognized in their communities as natural healers, medicine people, using them as kind of like a magnifying glass to be able to ignite a fire of sustainable community solutions. I want to thank you, not just for your time today and for your patience with the technical problems, but also the work that you do for bringing hope and help and healing to the people that you work with. It's difficult work, but in my opinion, it's, for me anyway, it's the only work worth doing. If you have any interest, this is how you can get a hold of me. I want to explain why I took the time to play those videos. It is much more important, I think, for you to hear what the originators and the people who have lived this experience have to say than a bunch of my tricky PowerPoint slides. That's the real meat and potatoes of this presentation. So I want to thank you for your time and for your attention. I'm not going to go through the rest of the slides. They're all there. You can take a look at them when you download the full PowerPoints. But I want to thank you for your time and for your patience with the whole process. And it's been an honor for me to explore this. And I want to thank you, Megan, for the opportunity to do this. So I'm stopping my share, and Natasha, back to you.
Thank you so much, Mike. We appreciate it. I'm going to let Megan take over, and thank you all so much.
Yeah, so you guys will each receive a follow-up email, and it'll include our evaluation survey link along with the presentation slides and any handouts that we may have had with this webinar. I appreciate all of you staying on as long as you could. Wanted to allow Mike some extra time with this important information, and it sounds like it was very powerful for many of you. So I appreciate the time that you spent with us today. And Mike, again, I thank you very much for your hard work on this and bringing this attention to all of us on today's webinar. So with that, everyone, I hope you have a great rest of your day, whatever time zone you're in, and take care of each other and yourselves. Okay. Thanks again, Mike.
Thank you. It's been a privilege.